Hello, everyone, and welcome to Accessibility Talks, or Alley Talks, as a lot of people know it. The monthly virtual meetup where we chat about digital accessibility, inclusivity, and accessibility. Each month, we invite a speaker to present a topic, and afterward, we invite the community to ask questions and participate in the discussion. Hello, I'm your host today. My name is Kat Shaw. I work at Lullabot as a lead engineer. I live in Perry, Kansas, which is about 1 hour outside of Kansas City, and I use the pronouns she and her. Before we get too far into the talk, I wanted to let you know that we have live transcripts available. There is going to be a link in the chat, but you can also access it at bit.ly/alleytalks-transcript. And you can also enable the YouTube closed captions if that works better for you. Let's take a moment to remind everyone that our group seeks to provide a friendly, safe environment. We do require all participants to adhere to the Accessibility Talks Code of Conduct. This includes speakers and hosts, those watching on YouTube, and folks commenting on social networks. This applies to all community interaction and events, verbal questions, and chat and text channels. This code of conduct can be found on our website at alleytalks.com. So that's A11yTalks.com. And all participants should be able to engage in productive dialogue and should share and learn with each other in an atmosphere of mutual respect. I want to give a shout out to our Alley Cat Club members. And thank you so much for your monthly financial contributions. And if you want to see your name on this list, visit the sponsorship page on alleytalks.com to learn more about our budget priorities and goals and how you can join the Alley Cat Club too. If you have questions, we love questions. At the end of the presentation, we'll take some time for Q&A. If you have a question for our speaker during the talk, there are a couple of ways you can do that. During our live talk, type in your question into the YouTube chat window. And it can be quite busy during the chat, so please start any question with the letter Q or the word question, so it's easier for us to find that during the live event. Also, you can add the hashtag AlleyTalks, that's A11yTalks, to Mastodon or Twitter. And our speaker, Gaurav, has already let us know that if you have questions during the talk, he is open to taking those during the talk as well. So today we have Gaurav Gupta, a Senior Director of Engineering at Smallcase. Some fun facts. You said you really like exploring different cuisines, especially when you're traveling, and you like to try out the local food whenever possible. Is that right?
That is correct, yes.
Yeah. So tell me, what are some of your favorite cuisines that you've tried out when you've traveled?
I think favorite is probably not the right word, but I do remember trying out a few things which I'll probably remember for life. I'll give you some examples. I tried this Vietnamese egg coffee when I went to Vietnam, which did not taste that great, but I will remember it for life just because I figured that it is something worth trying. In terms of cuisine that I really like, I think I do tend to like Asian food a lot, but specifically I think Japanese is something that I've been recently liking more than anything else. Not that I've traveled to Japan, but I have eaten it at multiple places, and yeah, I think that is mostly it. Yeah. Also, like, I mean, even while traveling within the country, since India is such a big country, like wherever you travel, the cuisine completely changes, which is again another point for me to try it out at multiple places within the country as well.
Yes, just like any country, there's different varieties of Indian food depending on the areas of India that you go. So that makes a lot of sense. And if you ever do visit Japan, I'll go with you. So
Sure. I mean, it is definitely in plans.
yeah, that's great. Well, so you are going to present today on semantic components and custom lint rules for improving the alley mindset. Is that right?
Yeah,
Great. So the floor is yours.
great. Well, I'll just get started. The title of my talk today is Accessibility Workflows, and I would be specifically talking about semantic components and custom lint rules. This talk is more suitable for people who have worked as a web developer earlier or are currently working as a web developer, but the concepts that are discussed throughout the talk are generally applicable, and hopefully even if you don't have complete understanding of the code that I'm going to talk about as part of these slides, you will still be able to grasp the overall concept. uh, I'll quickly introduce myself. I am Gaurav Gupta. I am currently based out of Bangalore, India, and I'm working for a fintech firm called Smallcase. Uh, you can find my Twitter handle and everything else at the end of the talk. But I've been working as a front end engineer for about 11 years now. And accessibility has been one of the web accessibility in particular has been one of the areas where I wanted to have more expertise on because I it really interests me. So I've been working with web accessibility for about 6 to 7 years now, and I worked across multiple code bases, worked with multiple libraries, and worked with multiple teams to figure out how accessibility impacts the overall workflow of an organization and how it can be part of it, which is where most of my learnings have come from. uh, this is one of the talks in a potential series of talks that I wanted to have, which is why it is like one of the accessibility workflows that I'm talking about in this particular presentation. But there are others where I talk about the other workflows as well. So, yeah, I think that's more of an introduction for myself. I'll just get started with the content. I tend to speak a bit faster sometimes, especially when I do understand whatever I'm talking about, and I tend to over explain it sometimes. In case you think I need to reduce the pace at which I'm speaking, just let me know in comments so that I can fix it there and then. For now, we'll just get started. Right. So I think just to introduce the concepts, what specifically I mean by accessibility workflows, it is any processes related to web accessibility that you follow as part of your code base. Now, this can just be having a dedicated QA for accessibility that is part of your accessibility workflow. It can just be making sure that you are testing whatever you're building as part of, let's say, your storybook integration. You may have some sort of accessibility testing. It might also be something where whenever you're writing tests, you are just using some accessibility testing libraries to test things, or you're writing tests in a manner which by default support accessible code. Say React testing library, maybe that is also accessibility workflow. uh, so I hope that clears what I mean by an accessibility workflow. And this particular workflow that I'm talking about is more developer oriented, where we would want developers to somehow have a bigger accessibility impact on the overall code base, even if they don't understand the concepts or the nuances of how something gets built. Next concept that I want to introduce is semantic components. Some of you might be thinking, aren't all components semantic? I would say they are semantic in some sense, because every component or every element that you see on the screen or that you interact with through whatever devices you are using, it has some meaning to someone. Maybe to the developer who built that component, it has some meaning. But in the context of this talk, I'm specifically talking about semantics for the end user, where the end user is not just a visual user, but they might be someone who is using a assistive device or assistive tech for going through your website or using your application. Which means, just to give you an example, if you have a tab component which looks like tabs visually, but it does not expose the same uh, accessibility handles that it should to the browser, then it is not a semantic component in the context of this talk. When I talk about semantic components, it just means that it has meaning for all the type of users that would use your application or would use that component, right? I'll quickly give you some examples as well. If you've been working with as a developer and you are building web components, you might already know that by default a lot of HTML components are semantic components, because if you see that someone is using the article tag, the browser understands that it is supposed to have some specific content. The developer understands that it is supposed to have some specific content, and the user also understands, because the browser exposes it to them in through the browser API in some form or the other. What we are going to talk about though are very specific examples of this semantic component thought process. Now when I say thought process, I would say that whatever I've been explaining till now is already being followed. If you see any component libraries out in the wild for any component based framework, you will find that there are a lot of good, really good components which are built with this semantic understanding or accessibility concerns in mind, or visual concerns as well, or all the different concerns that a user might have. So there are already a lot of semantic components that exist in open source libraries, or maybe some design systems as well, but they are generic enough to be applicable across all the code bases, but they are not specific to a certain code base. And that is where we figured that it actually requires a certain extension to that thought process to start thinking about these semantic components within the context of of your code base, your or code base. And many of these things might not be applicable generally to, let's say, whatever the different component libraries are building for. Some of the examples of these smaller semantic components are something like a close button. Now this close button might just be a repeated pattern within your code base, that you have different pop-ups, you have different modals, you always add a close button to them, or you have a banner where you add a close button. And it might happen that all of your developers are just directly creating a close button there and then, because it is a small enough thing to be created with just two lines of code, which is the thought process that we tried to change in our code base, where we wanted to make sure that if it is a close button, if we can identify that a small component is semantic enough to be extracted as a reusable component, and in that reusable component we could solve for the accessibility concerns as well, that would be great. As well as on top of it, if we can enforce everyone to use that component instead of building their own, that would be a plus one on top of it. So these are some examples. Like a close button is very specific to your code base. I don't think it would be meaningful for a component library to provide you a semantic close button, because again, visually it will look very different from what you want. The text that you want to read out as part of a screen reader focus on the close button might be very different. So which is why I think this is very specific to your code. An image button, for example, can still be generic, that it can be provided by these libraries, but then again, I don't think anyone has really been providing this as part of the component library. Similarly, a back button is specific to your code base. A icon only button might be specific to your code base, because the way that you use icons might be very different from how other code bases use icons. I'll actually make it more clear with an example. So what I'm going to do right now is I'll walk through an example where we'll just take one of these components, try to understand how such a small component can be more semantic and can be extracted, and what are the considerations that we should have while extracting something like this. So we'll just take one example out of these, and that is hopefully how I'll be able to explain the thought process better. So we'll just take this close button example. Uh, so at small case, we do have a code base where we have a lot of pop-ups or modal dialogues or banners, or yeah, some sort of dismissible cards, where we tend to use this cross icon. And to the end user, to the visual user, it is similar in all the instances, but internally we might have been using different components for the same functionality. So I'll just go through an example on how to build this close button as a semantic reusable component and add all the accessibility considerations on top. So on the slide, I have mentioned a few things that we would want to consider if we want a close button. One is that like it should have a good enough tap area which is aligned with whatever guidelines your project requires, or whatever guidelines according to AAA you want to follow, right? So there has to be a certain tap area consideration. It cannot be just that whatever symbol you are looking at on the screen is the only thing which is clickable, because that symbol in itself might be too small. The X symbol in this case might be too small of a tap area. Then the second thing that this button should have is an accessible label, because in not in all the cases this X means close. In some cases it might mean dismiss, or in some cases it might, you might want to present more information that that the user is actually closing a particular login pop-up, say, right? So this has to have an accessible label. This obviously has to be focusable. This has to have a border when it is focused. This has to have a cursor change, probably, like this might be arguable, but just to make sure that the visual user can also see that this is a clickable button, uh, it has to have a cursor. Now, the first thing that we would want to do to make sure that some of these concerns are already mitigated is to use an actual button. Now, I would say this seems like a very small thing and it seems like this should be obvious, but this is definitely not obvious. Even in the code base that I was working with, I was able to see that a lot of developers are actually using a span or a div tag to just encapsulate that particular icon and just have a on click on top of that div, which does not really make sense. So the easiest thing to do in this case would be to just use a button. And once you use a button, it will allow focus and tab by default, and it will have better accessibility consideration by default, because the HTML button is more semantic on its own. The only thing that you will need to do here is to make sure that you reset the global button styles that are, let's say, already provided by the browser to make it look like what we want. So this is just step one, and we have already started seeing that it, although it is a very small component, if you want to build it properly, there is a certain set of things that you would need to do, which would mean that it is not as easy as every developer creating their own anytime they want. So this is just the first step, that we want to make sure that everyone just uses a button for this whenever they want to create it. Then, like, this is how the code example would look like. We'll have a button, and it would have a on click handler, and it would just have an icon within it. This is the first step. This is how our component looks like after the first step. Now we'll go to the next requirement, which is this button should have an accessible label. So in this case, the best thing that we figured out we could do was, since this is a close button, we could actually have a default label for it, as well as we could allow overriding the label through a prop. So in that also, we would want to consider that instead of just expecting the consumers of the button to pass in an aria label, because that is not the only way to label components, we would instead expect a label prop, and that label prop is something that you explicitly forward to this component, and this component can internally implement that label in a manner that it wants. It might use a aria label, or it can also use a screen reader only span, or maybe some other implementation altogether, to make sure that this label is accessible to the assistive technology, uh, meanwhile making sure that the consumers do not need to care about the exact internal implementation. So this is how the component would look like after we make this change. So we initially started with a button which encapsulate an icon. We added an on click, and now we added a aria label internally to the button. This could have been some other implementation also. This could have, instead of an aria label, it could have been a screen reader only span as well. But this is the second step that we did. Now it is already getting slightly more complex than just being a span with a close icon. We'll go to the next step. Now the third thing is, so we would probably want to pass on extra. So okay, at this point in time, I'll probably want to explain that this code example that I am going through is specific to React in some manner, but it is generally applicable to any DOM based libraries. The presentation is more towards having this component in React, which is why you might see some React specific code as well. Feel free to ask about it if you need more clarification, or you can also ignore it if you don't like really understand the code, but you just understand the concept that in itself is enough, right? So the third thing that we want to make sure of is whatever the consumer of the close button component wants to do with the close button, or the underlying HTML element, like which is the button, we actually expose those things to the consumer as well. For example, uh, the consumer of the close button may want to forward some other ARIA props to this component, which is where our component needs to make sure that it supports it, because it is now abstracting or encapsulating an HTML element which the consumer needs access to. So which is where we just add some some sort of handling where the consumer can just pass whatever they want to pass, and we will be able to apply it to the underlying HTML element, and it would not get lost. So this is like kind of giving them the flexibility that they use the close button, but they still can use it like a regular button by passing whatever they want to pass to it, and we'll just override whatever we think is right for this close button to be a specific type of button, which is like a close button. So this was the third thing. I don't think this is uh, really interesting to folks who have not been working in React, but I just wanted to make sure that this is here for completion if any React folks are watching. The next thing that we want to cater for is tap area. Again, now would want to point out that this is again getting slightly more complex than just having a span with a close button, which is to prove the point that why, like that the practice where you think that this is a small enough component you can just build it on your own every time you need it is not really making sense now, right? Because you see that there are a lot of different considerations that you need to have, and it would be really good to just have a usable component called close button or whatever, which you can use for uh, having a close button across your code base. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the tap area. Now, tap area has certain guidelines in terms of the different accessibility standards on AAA, but it might be that your particular team also has some guidelines on how much you want to have that tap area. So, in this case, since we want to make sure that there is a certain tap area by default for the close button, but we also want to make sure that the consumers can place the close button in a manner that it still looks visually correct, we would want to make sure that we can cater to it using some internal handling. So in this case, what we would end up doing, or what we ended up doing in our code base is, we added a wrapper which takes care of the tap area. So let's say you want the tap area to be 44 by 44, which is like a good size. Like, I'm not going into the technical details of what exactly it should be on mobile devices or web or whatever, but let's say you want it to be 44 by 44, but your consumer just has a requirement of a 16 by 16 cross icon, which visually looks like a 16 pixel by 16 pixel icon, but you want to make sure that if someone wants to click it, they are able to click on the whole 44 by 44 area and not just the X button, which is 16 by 16, which is why we add a wrapper which takes care of the tap area. This wrapper is again 44 pixel by 44 pixel, and we still allow the consumer to control the size of the icon itself. So if they want the size of the icon to be 16 pixel, that is perfectly fine with us, but the tap area would still remain 44 pixel. Now the next challenge for the consumer would be to be able to position this close button correctly, because the wrapper is 44 pixel and the close button itself is 16 pixel. So which is what we enable through the rest of the things that we are going to discuss in this slide. So those are again slightly focused on React or component framework, so feel free to skip if you don't understand, but I hope you understand the problem that we are trying to solve. So how we implemented it is, having a default class name prop for the icon itself, and also allowing the consumer to change the classes on the wrapper, right? And we also allowed a easy change in the icon size by having a icon size prop. So this is how our component looks like now that we have these two or three different considerations as well. So just to reiterate, we already are using a button, we already have an on click which by default also works with keyboard, which also by default works with all assistive technology because we are using a button. Then we have also added a label, which internally we might be using ARIA label or screen reader only span or something else to implement. We also have a way to pass on the uh, props from the parent consumer element to the underlying HTML element. And now this is the fourth thing that we are building, which is making sure that the tab area considerations for accessibility can also be taken care of by default in the component, and the consumer does not need to do anything specific. So for that, we added a class name to the wrapper, as well as we added a class name to the internal icon, so that they can control the size of the icon, as well as if they want certain things in the wrapper, which is again optional, they can also change something in the wrapper, right? And this is the default style of the wrapper that we consider. So in this example, I've just shown 24 by 24 as the tab area that I would want to have as default. But in general, this could be whatever your code base requires. And in case someone wants to override it, they wouldn't really need to override the height and width of the wrapper itself, but they can still override some of the other things in the wrapper. Let's say maybe they want to change the text, the font for some reason, or maybe change some sort of white space things in the wrapper from CSS. They can still do it, but by default this wrapper would always have 24 by 24, which means that it is one less decision for your consumers to take on how much of a tab area would they want. And in most cases they don't even know that they should comply to a 24 by 24 pixel tab area, which is where this comes in handy, which is why this talk that having a semantic component actually improves the overall accessibility posture of the code base, as well as also improves the accessibility mindset of the developers who are working, because once they get to understand how this semantic component works, they would be able to learn more about why 24 by 24 is required or 44 by 44 is required, right? So now that we have created the component, of course I've missed a few things in terms of accessibility, but I just wanted to have this as an example that even a small component like a close button still needed four different considerations from our side to make sure that it is properly accessible, and hence it makes a strong case of making it a reusable component and making sure that everyone across the org is actually using the same component and not creating one of their own, because we are pretty sure that if they end up creating one of their own, they would definitely miss out on one of the four things that we have already implemented as part of this component. So now you have a semantic component which solves for the first part, and which is also the first part of this talk, that we were able to identify that there are some small semantic components that can be built as reusable components. We took an example of a close button and we were able to do it. Now the next thing is, how do we ensure that the other devs in your team end up using it? Like, till now we have not been able to make sure that nobody else, let's say somebody who joins the team tomorrow, uh, would they not end up creating their own span with a close icon? I don't think there is any real way for us to do it, even if we do a lot of trainings or even if we do a lot of knowledge transfer that this is how you should be using the close button. It does not enforce it in code, which is the problem. Which is why we would want to make sure that there is something in code which can somehow enforce it, which is where the lint rules come in, right? So this is how you enforce the adoption of your component. So there is something called ESlint. For people who are unaware, this is a linter which helps you raise some errors or warnings while you are writing code, because it is able to do a static check on the code that you are writing and be able to tell you that whatever you are doing is against the uh, guidelines of this particular code base. Or like, it also has some generic rules for React, it also has some generic rules for accessibility as well. But what I'm talking about right now is, since you created your own semantic component and you understand the patterns or the anti patterns that people would be using to not be using this component, then you can just write a specific ESLint rule which is going to be a custom lint rule, and make sure that the other developers, whenever they try to bypass or they don't know that they should use this particular component, they are warned that there is a component that exists and you should probably use it. So this is where now, like, we'll go into some detail about how to write your own ESLint rule for this purpose, and what does that ESLint rule actually mean for the rest of the devs, right? So in this case, I'm just showing you an example that if you were to figure out who is using the close icon incorrectly, you would probably have a few things in mind. They can be either heuristic based, or they can also be something specific in the code base in terms of pattern. But I'm just giving you one example, which is the uh, wherever there is a close button, you will definitely find this I class name is equal to icon close, right? This is something that you will definitely find. So this is one good starting point, which we also started with, and we figured that whenever we find this icon close class name, we should just check the surrounding context and try to make sure that it is uh, a, it is not an incorrect usage, right? So this is where we started from, and again in this slide I am mostly talking about the code. So if you want to ignore the code, you can. I'll just explain to you quickly what this means. So this is a function which returns or like which looks for class name and checks if the class name has icon close in it, which is like saying if you have any component, not just a I tag, but if you have any other tag where you would have a class name and the class name has icon close in it, then it will be able to identify that component, because this whole code when written in the ESlint context just walks through the DOM tree, and uh, by DOM tree I mean the static DOM tree that it internally creates, which is the AST mostly, and it will look for all the all the different elements that have class name attribute, and it will look for all the elements which have class name as icon close, right? So this is just the first part of the code. We have now been able to identify which components uh, are using icon close, but we have not really done what exactly needs to be done, which is like telling them that you need to make sure that you use the close button component instead of using your own icon close, right? And these are some valid examples of how how people can write code which is still valid and which does not get caught by our ESLint rule. So they can just have a div with class name which is icon not close, which is fine, because probably this probably means that they are not actually creating a close button, because if they were creating a close button, they would be using icon close class. And then the next piece of code is also valid because they are using icon close, but it is in a different attribute altogether, not in class name. So it might be fine. Again, some of this might be hit and a miss in the second example. For example, even though that example is valid according to the rule that we have written, it might still mean that somebody is using that code to create a close button. That is something that our rule would definitely not be able to figure out, which is why the rule is not 100% effective, but it is still good enough for most of the anti patterns that your team is using. Some examples of invalid code would be so this invalid code is where we will actually raise a warning or an error saying that you cannot use this code and you should use the close button component directly. So yeah, just some examples where if there is a component with class name as icon close, it will definitely catch it because that is what we look for. If there is a component which has a class name which has multiple class names, one of which is icon close, it will also tag it. There are also false positives in this case, which is like if a component has class name icon close something, which is not exactly icon close, but it starts with icon close. The based on the current code that we've written, which we can definitely improve upon, this code would just mark it as invalid, even though this is not really invalid. So yeah, on this slide are multiple examples of code that would be caught by our lint rule to make sure that people are not using any sort of close icon directly, because we are pretty confident that whenever someone is using the close icon, they are probably missing out on the accessibility bits, and we should make sure that they use the close button component, right? Now this is just one part of it. Now whatever I have talked about is the ESLint uh, tool, which only works with HTML and JavaScript, but like there is a way for devs to just use the icon close component in CSS directly, which is where we also have another linter which is called style lint. So you can also write a style lint rule to make sure that no one is using icon close uh, as a class name or uh, as a CSS class somewhere from your CSS, right? So we these examples again talk mostly about a certain implementation of CSS modules which we use in our code base. So we'll not go more into more details around it. But the crux is that even with CSS, which is another place where people can actually start having these sort of anti patterns, you do have some kind of linting available, and the linter tooling in CSS also allows you to have your own specific lint tool, which I'll just go through an example of. So in our case particularly, this was true that whatever CSS we were writing, we were able to walk through that CSS tree as well as part of the linter provided hooks. And similarly, we could check that if a particular component composes the icon close class, or if somehow someone ends up using icon close in CSS directly, we can again identify it and also report it by throwing an error or throwing a warning message that you should not use icon close here, and you should probably be using the close button component directly, right? So this is how the end result looks like. I'll just like quickly go through the end result, and then uh, maybe I can just summarize the crux of this example and then take questions. But the end result, if you see, this is the first screen, which is an existing component. If I hover over it, you could see that this was a I element with just a icon close on it, right? But when we changed it finally to a proper close button icon, now you can a proper close button which we created as a semantic component. Now you can see that it now has a proper 24 by 24 tap area, while earlier it used to have a 14 by 14 tap area only. It now is using a button, which means it is part of the accessibility tree by default. It is keyboard accessible by default, and all the different problems that we solved. And it still looks the same visually, right? I mean, to a visual user, since whatever you're saying in the blue color is the focus outline when you hover over an element in Chrome. But apart from that, everything looks exactly the same. So what we've been able to achieve is, one, making sure that creating this component does not actually change anything for the visual user, which I think most people were catering to when they were directly trying to write this component or write this close button in code instead of using a reusable component. That is something that we have maintained. Second, we have also solved things for the users of assistive tech or keyboard only users, or maybe mouse users in some cases as well, and still made sure that the component remains simpler to use. And which is where I think we circle back to the point that the first step was to identify that there are some smaller semantic components that do exist in plain sight, but we are not generally able to identify it. Once identified, created in a manner that it solves for all the different accessibility concerns as well as all the different user concerns for other sort of users as well. And then make sure you enforce it somehow in your code, which is through lint rules, through ESlint or style lint in this case. And the fourth thing is just make sure that it is as easy to use as it was for other people to write a new component or write a new code themselves for making this icon close, right? So this is mostly the walkthrough of the example that I wanted to have. I think I'll quickly just go back to the other examples and also touch upon them in a manner so that you understand some other examples better. So whatever we have done for close button, we can do the exact same thing for a back button, because the back button again is similar to a close button in structure, right? You might have a back button icon, or you might have a text saying back. So you can easily identify that in code, and you can enforce that everyone uses your back button component instead of creating a small span there and then and just using it. Similarly, there are some components which do not have any visual uh, correlation with them, which is like a focus trap component. So a focus trap is a very specific bit. Like we may not even call it an element, but in a component based workflow, I think we can still create a component out of it. So a focus trap is just a component which just takes care of trapping the focus within the model when you are in a model sort of situation. Or if there are other use cases for trapping the focus, it can just be a semantic component, right? Instead of people needing to write that bit of JavaScript every time they want to do a focus trap, they can actually just use the semantic component. Similarly, a icon in itself, even though it is very small, it can still in itself be a semantic component, because sometimes there are like accessibility semantics which are related with an icon which is not within an interactive element. So anything that is inside a button or an anchor tag is already taken care of by the label on the parent. But there are in some cases there are icons which are, let's say, just informative, but you still want to have some sort of accessible text associated to them. So which is why you can just create a semantic icon component, which always asks for a like semantic accessible text associated to it. So these are just some of the examples of other smaller components that you can think of as semantic components. And you can have similar considerations for linting rules that you can create, which are very specific to your code base, custom to your code base, custom to your component, specific to whatever your team is working on, and make sure that they get enforced throughout your team. And this will definitely help the accessibility posture of the whole application, because your end users would definitely get a benefit of it. Second, it will, like, for your developers, it would not be a steep path to learn accessibility, because I mean, I do think that even though everyone should be aware of how to make things accessible by default, a very less number of people do have that understanding, especially because in a lot of cases it is very subjective. So someone who is just starting out as a developer sometimes does not understand the nuances, and they end up doing things in a manner which are not actually constructive. It is more or less destructive to uh, folks using assistive technology. So this sort of semantic component reusability helps them take their own time to actually get to a point where they understand the in depth of how something becomes accessible, but in the meanwhile still making sure that they are not doing any harm to your users because they are still using these components, right? So this is mostly what I wanted to talk about. I'll just go towards the end of the slide so to discuss some of the references for this, for the technical implementation as well as for the thought process itself, and then I can take some questions. So some of the references that helped me write this code. One is related to how you write styling plugins. I think this is easy to find if you want to write styling plugins. Similarly, writing your own ESlint rules or plugins is again something very easy to find. For this particular presentation, I used the target size minimum from the accessibility guidelines from WCAG, and similarly keyboard plus focus visible I used from the guidelines provided. Then again, accessible label is also something that I just used from the vocab guidelines which are provided. With this, I would end my talk. Hopefully, it was interesting enough, if not really informative, because it used code examples which you might not have understood. But I hope that it was interesting enough that you are more interested in this topic itself and more interested in solving these problems in a manner that we have discussed. Uh, Thank you. I guess we can take questions if there is anything. Over to you, Kat, if there is a.
Wonderful job. Thank you so much. That was all very informative. And as we talked earlier, I'm working on a project right now that is a React project, and I focus on accessibility. So this is all very timely for me. So we do have some questions to check out. So the first one is, can these tests be run locally and with automated tests in pull requests?
Right. So these are not exactly tests which run on the code that you have already written. I mean, it is a sort of a lint which is different, slightly different from a test. But yeah, I think for a general understanding, this is like test, which is, if you have worked with ESLint, you know that it can actually run as you are typing your code. So definitely it can run on your local. It can run as part of your, whenever you want to commit to your particular branch, you can have a commit hook which checks for all the ESLint comments. You can still run it as part of your PR workflow, where every time you push code to a certain PR, it runs the ESLint workflow and make sure that you fix everything that is required before you can push it. And definitely once it is on something like GitHub, you can run it in a manner that it, whenever you raise a PR, it automatically runs the linting. So it is definitely possible. And this has nothing to do with the current implementation really. It is more to do with something like an ESLint or style lint is written in a manner that it can run as part of your developer workflow at different places, and this is just an added test on the same ESLint workflow, which is why it can just use whatever ESLint or style lint by default provides. So to answer your question, yes, these can be run locally. As soon as you type something, you can run it, and they can also be run at the very end of the developer workflow, which is where you raise a PR and it needs to get reviewed.
Has this been added as a VS Code extension, or is it just something done through the command line right now?
So right now, so this what we have done is we have created a new ESlint module, sort of, where we just include it as part of our like whenever we do an npmi, the latest version of that gets installed, and that rule is enabled in our ESlint RC. So whenever you type anything, that rule kicks in, similar to other ESlint rules that you use, and it just tells you about whether whatever you're doing is right or wrong. So there is no specific extension which we have created for it or has been required for it, because it's a separate ESLint module that we as an organization maintain, and we just refer it in the node modules of our consumer application, and making sure that however you enable the rest of the ESLint rules, you just enable this rule as well, and everything gets taken care of automatically.
That's great. Okay. Next question is, are your rules following WCAG 2.1 or 2.2?
So at the time that I was doing this presentation for the first time, we were following 2.1. I don't think we have actually gone ahead and changed anything major in the rules to comply to 2.2. But also I would say that that is a very small part of the overall workflow itself. Like making changes accordingly to make sure that it complies with 2.2 is something that one person in the team can do, while the overall workflow is like sorted for the rest of the team automatically, just because we follow this particular thought process. So yeah, but to answer that question, right now, whenever these rules were written in the code base, they were written with 2.1 in mind.
Yeah, I heard you mention the target size. So I know the target size minimum now in 2.2 is just part of the, I think it's level A or AA. Was that when it was 2.1, you included the AAA level in your lint rules then?
I don't think so. I think the AAA was still 44 in 2.1.
Mm-hmm.
If I remember correctly. I think 24 was probably AA, or it was probably something to do with mobile devices where you had to have 24.
Okay.
I Yeah.
Okay. Next question. Have you tried implementing this with component libraries like Storybook?
Like Storybook in our case, as part of our developer workflow, it does not provide a component library on its own. It is more like a component playground that we use it for, which is like we have our internal component library which we maintain as a monorepo, and those components then get finally displayed as part of the storybook for review or maybe for someone to play with. And we do use it in storybook as well as but these tests, they do not have any, or these lint rules, or these like semantic components in itself, they do not have anything to do with storybook. Just that in storybook we are just able to test it further, that whatever semantic component we have created with the storybook accessibility add-on, sometimes we are just able to test that it is working as expected, and it is not being marked as something which is inaccessible itself by default, because it will just break everything that we wanted to do.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because I did see that the components you created, I mean, obviously those are perfect for like a React Storybook setup. So, you just run the ESLint rules with that setup, and it would test those Storybook components if that's what you were using. So, okay, great. Next questions, are these components and lint rules available as open source? And so I think you kind of mentioned that with being able to install this with npm. Is that right?
That is right, but then I also mentioned that these are very specific to the way that your team writes code. If it was already generic enough, somebody would have solved it in the component libraries itself, right? For example, if you see a tab component, it is generic enough that any component library provides it. If you see a date picker component, any component library provides it, because those are so generic that you can solve it once in the component library and everyone can just use it. But this thought process that I've been talking about is very, very specific to your code base, because your code base has a way to use the close button in a manner that only your developers know, right? Maybe in my code base I'm using an icon with a icon close class name. In your code base, this close button might be implemented using something else, and the anti patterns are also something else altogether. So my ESlint rule is actually not going to help you. I can still extract something out of this whole setup where I can say that, okay, I can still provide you some generic ESlint rule where you can fill in some information and it will be able to catch whatever you need. But I think, yeah, that is not the point of this approach. I think this approach is very like this is just an extension of whatever all these component libraries have already been doing for bigger components, and this is very specific to your code base so that you can control everything, right? I'll give you an example of something called a help link that we use. So we figured that there are a lot of places in the code base where we are using links which just say click here for more help, or for help click here, or just help, or just click me, or more, or whatever, right? So we identified that this is actually a pattern that our designers have created, which is very specific to our application. And on top of that, now we want to have a semantic component called help link, which will make sure that there is always an accessible default text, which is not just click here, right? So those sort of things are only possible, or like better suited to your code base specifics, which is why I think we have never thought about having these as open source, but we've actually tried to like translate some of the rules that we internally implemented as generic open source rules, where we directly ended up uh, contributing to the uh, original libraries like ESLint accessibility rules, whatever they were doing. It made sense to just add it to their setup instead of creating a one. But honestly speaking, this has not been a thought process. Like, we do not want to create it as something which is open source, because it is more about the thought process than the actual rule itself. The actual rule might not even be applicable to your code base, because the thought process says that it has to be very specific to your code base.
Okay. And you said you have submitted some things to ESlint itself.
Yeah, I think we have contributed in some manner
Mhm.
where it was making sense to have a generic have a generic solution for something. I think there is a rule for again help links or something related to links, where we were using some sort of matching mechanism which could tell you that this link needs more context, and identifying those links and then making sure that those links can be flagged. So just that. I mean, it's not a big contribution as such. It is just one part of the ESLint accessibility plugin,
Hmm.
where somebody else was also sort of creating the same rule as we were, and we just like collaborated a bit on that.
Great. It'd be great to have on your references, do you have a link to that source? Like if somebody wanted to go look at where all of that is
I
that
do. I
in your
think
resource?
on my GitHub contributions, you'll be able to easily find it, because most of my GitHub contributions are around accessibility itself. So yeah, like in my GitHub I think I'll just put it here as well.
Okay, great. I think we have one more question. How did you get started in your interest in delivering accessible components?
Right. I think I'll probably talk about how what interested me in terms of accessibility itself and not just components. I was working with an organization where it was part of their workflow that everything has to be QA'd by someone who looks at the overall accessibility of the organization, which is where I got to understand that, okay, whatever I have been building till now with no real care for people who cannot see what my component is, uh, like that is when I got to understand that, okay, this is something that was majorly missing in my thought process as a web developer. And that is when it started. It was, I think, around uh, 7 to 8 years ago, and I was building a search engine for like one of the publications. And that is when I realized that this as a product needs to be more accessible to people. And that realization just happened because they already had it as part of their workflow, that everything that you build has to pass certain accessibility checks by the bigger team in the organization. And that is how I got to know that, okay, this stream of like let's say engineering exists as such, that there are people who are actually solving for these problems, and that is how I got started as well.
That's great. I think that having those kinds of tests and standards built in is just a great way to make sure that things are working properly. When you mentioned like the button is a very simple example, people using span or divs or whatever, and having roll equals button is not the same as using just an actual button for screen reader users, especially. So yeah, that's wonderful that you have set this up. That's a really great presentation. So I really appreciate everything that you have presented on, and thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks a lot, Kat. I think this was really helpful to have you around as well. Uh, Cool. Yeah, I think I don't have anything else to add from my side. All my social links are already available on the comments. You guys can reach out to me anytime you want. For getting a link to the presentations, I think I can just post it, or we can just post it on the channel on Twitter maybe. And if you have any particular questions about this semantic components or in general accessibility workflows that we use in our setup, feel free to reach out to me. I do not mind at all. I would want to have more discussions on this. So feel free to reach out. Thank you.
That's great. Definitely. I might even reach out to you. So thanks again, Gaurav. Appreciate it. Okay. So coming up in January, we are going to have a talk called Creating Accessible and Inclusive Presentations with our own Amy June Heinlein. So mark your calendars for January 17th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We are always looking for new speakers and new voices in the accessibility community. We make a conscious effort to include marginalized groups in tech and in our speaker lineup. If you are interested, please reach out to us at team@A11yTalks.com. So that's team@A11yTalks.com. For those with IAAP certifications, Ali Talks speakers and attendees receive professional development credits, and those are called CAECs, through IAAP for the continuing education. So make sure you submit those, because just by watching this, you get that. And we would also love your input. Please let us know if you have any ideas on how to make Ali Talks more friendly to all. Subscribe to our YouTube channel to never miss a talk. You can go to youtube.com/accessibility talks. Consider contributing to Ali Talks through our Open Collective page, opencollective.com/Ali Talks. Follow us on Twitter, also known as X, or Mastodon. And thank you for attending. Appreciate it.